Hello, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. My name is John Ballai. I'm the Manager of Planning and Operations at Susquehanna River Basin Commission, and we're going to spend the next hour covering an overview of the Commission's new Consumptive Use Mitigation Grant Program. To kick things off, we just wanted to review a few of the webinar logistics in play for today. First off being, we're recording the session today primarily to make it available to folks after the session should they choose to view it and could not participate in today's or our second session on December 8th. You'll notice all lines have been muted just to avoid distractions and allow us to cover the content we have planned for today. So we're asking anyone with questions, and we sure hope there are plenty, to use the chat function to pose those. And we have someone here with us assigned to monitoring the chat function, extracting questions, and we'll have plenty of time to cover those after the presentation. We plan the session will run for approximately 30 minutes with slide content, and again, plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. Folks interested in posing any follow-up questions or requests for clarification, we'll direct you to the email and phone and extension provided at the bottom of the slide here, which is also included in a lot of the materials we've provided in support of the new grant program. So with logistics covered, I'm going to turn things over to Andrew Dayhoff, our Executive Director, for a welcome and some opening remarks from him. Drew.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's good to see a broad and diverse group of participants. We really appreciate your interest in this topic. Hopefully you've been following Commission activities lately. It's been a very exciting 18 months in the world of consumptive use mitigation here. That began in March of 2020 with the adoption of our first formal consumptive use mitigation policy. And our intent with that was to clarify our mitigation objectives, but also expand options for how SRBC would undertake and achieve its mitigation goals, and offering some options in addition to our traditional method of acquiring water storage. In the time following the adoption of the policy, we rolled out some pilot initiatives with some select partners to look at some innovative approaches for mitigation, including things like water conservation and watershed restoration, and hopefully in the coming months, and we will start to see some fruits of those efforts to share with you. So now we find ourselves in a position of wanting to do more, and we thought that rather than ramp up our internal capacity, we thought it would be a good idea to open up and expand outside the Commission and offer our external partners a piece of the action. So thus was born the grant program that was rolled out a couple weeks ago. It closely follows the new options and standards laid out in the 2020 policy. But like I said, also opens up to you some external partners in the hopes that we can accomplish more and sooner. So these are exciting times for us, but we're also entering some uncharted territory. We are looking forward to a discussion and offering you some information and answering questions, but don't be surprised if we don't have good answers to, we may not have anticipated all the questions we may get, but we will certainly do our best to answer those questions. And I think it's safe to say, learn from our experience this year. We do intend this to be not a one and done, but an opportunity that we will offer again, recognizing it may evolve as we learn and see what projects work out best. But know for now that we are very interested in hearing from you. We're interested in some innovative ideas. We look forward to getting some projects on the ground and very much look forward to working with our water users and those who are familiar with our watersheds. So thanks again for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you. John?
Great. Thank you, Drew. So this slide gives a high-level overview of the agenda or key topics we plan to cover in the slide. We'll give an introduction to our agency and the program overall. To start things, we'll talk about the purpose, and Drew hit on some of the key points here relative to the purpose of us choosing to stand up this new grant program. We'll cover some of the priorities we're looking for in terms of eligible projects and funding. We'll talk about eligibility not only in terms of applicants, but also the project types. And we'll also provide some examples of different projects that fit into each of the project categories eligible for funding under the grant. I'll transition things to Andy Gavin, our Deputy Executive Director, to cover eligible use of funds, total funding under the grant program in this first inaugural year, as well as our anticipated individual project funding levels. We'll talk about some of the things we're looking for in our online application, and then we'll close with the schedule. And again, afterwards transition to a question and answer period. We hope we'll have plenty of time for that, and we'd encourage you again to post any questions you have in the chat at any time during the session so that we can grab those and make sure we cover them as best we can with the remaining time today. So for folks not intimately familiar with the Commission's work, this slide kind of gives an overview of our agency. We're fairly unique in that we're a Federal Interstate Compact Commission. Our jurisdictions defined by the watershed boundaries shown in the graphic on the right. And our member jurisdictions and the commissioners that represent the Commission are designated from the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, as well as the federal government, currently represented by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. And generally, our mission is to enhance public welfare through comprehensive planning, water supply allocation, and management of the water resources of this 27,500 and change square mile watershed. As an introduction, and Drew covered some of this in his opening remarks, we wanted to just give an overview of consumptive use, our requirement to mitigate for consumptive use, and the policy that really laid the groundwork for this new grant program. So when we refer to consumptive use of water, we're generally referring to water withdrawn and used in a way that's not returned to the basin in an equal quantity. So you can think about water that could be applied as irrigation to golf course and through evapotranspiration is lost, water that's contributed to product like soda or bottled water, or water used in the cooling process at power generation facilities and lost through evaporative means. Associated with the Commission's regulation of consumptive water use, there's a requirement for those water users to provide mitigation for their consumptive use during low flow periods, conceivably to avoid impacts and any number of impacts that could occur. There are a number of ways projects can comply with that mitigation requirement. Generally, they can provide physical mitigation in and adjacent to or immediately surrounding their project, or they also have the option to pay a fee in lieu of providing a physical mitigation. And for many projects, there are reasons that physical mitigation development is not feasible for them. Drew mentioned in his opening remarks our consumptive use mitigation policy adopted by our commissioners in March of 2020. It did a number of things to solidify our consumptive use mitigation program, but most important to this grant was an expanded scope of alternatives for us to pursue as commission-initiated mitigation projects. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about that scope of alternatives because it translates into eligible project types for funding under the grant program. And ultimately, that policy was a catalyst or motivation largely for this grant program we launched on November 1 here a few weeks ago. So the purpose of the grant program and us standing it up is to identify, fund, and implement projects to mitigate for consumptive use, particularly during droughts and low flow periods. This has been the purpose of the program for a long time, and we've done that and attempted to move out on this in an opportunistic fashion, and it allowed us to develop projects like water supply storage at Cowanesque and Kerwinsville Lakes, or partner on abandoned mine drainage and low flow augmentation at Lancashire and Crescent abandoned mine drainage treatment plants, and a number of other projects. Most recently, Bill Meyer Quarry water supply storage project in Lancaster County. But with the grant program, and Drew alluded to this in his opening remarks again, we're hoping to get word out outside of our four walls in our agency's headquarters and look to solicit innovative projects from outside stakeholders and project sponsors. So we're hoping this annual grant award, and again, this is the first year of what we hope will be an annual award, will really kind of kickstart and allow us to accelerate implementation of projects for mitigating consumptive use in the Susquehanna drainage. Some of the priorities we called out in the grant program guidelines, which is available on our website, are listed here. At the top and fundamental is watersheds that we've identified as having high consumptive use or more limited water availability. Those watersheds are shown in the figure on the right, and that figure is included in the program guidelines to kind of show areas that projects that are proposed in them would conceivably score more favorably. That's not to mean projects outside those areas are not eligible. It's just a scoring preference. Projects in environmental justice areas are another priority, as well as projects that have a direct connection to increased climate resilience for the water resources of the basin. And then the last four bullet points here as priorities really pertain to the expanded scope of alternatives in the case of the latter two, but basically the project categories eligible for funding under the grant program. So additional water supply storage assets, improved operations, whether they be reservoir conservation releases, conjunctive use of both ground and surface water, or just drought operations that shrink the water use footprint during drought conditions. The water conservation category, the second to last bullet, with increased water conservation, reuse, and recycling. And then the last area of priority project types, perhaps the broadest in scope, include enhanced groundwater recharge, mine drainage treatment, stormwater management, and so forth. We'll cover these last four bullet points in more detail here in the coming slides. So in terms of eligible applicants, as we've defined those in the program guidelines, and the online application is built to identify these categories from drop-downs. They include project sponsors, and that means regulated water use projects that have an approval from the Susquehanna River Basin Commission that are operating in or adjacent to the watershed. Local, state, and federal government entities, tax-exempt nonprofits or NGOs, and then academicians, institutions of higher education. They're the four categories that are spelled out as being eligible applicants. In terms of eligible projects, and this will build on some of the information cited in the earlier priority slide, these are the four basic eligible project categories, if you will, that we've outlined in the guidelines. And again, these are directly connected to our consumptive use mitigation policy and the section that relates to eligible project types. They include the top two, which have been where our more traditional focus has been, and that's to acquire additional water supply storage assets, whether they're impoundments like federal water supply storage reservoirs, abandoned flooded limestone quarries, the work we've done to try to repurpose flooded anthracite and bituminous coal mine pools, but also interconnections that increase water supply for a system. The second category, again, what we would characterize as a more traditional focus of ours, relates to operational changes. So things like reservoir conservation releases, focused improvement or enhancement relative to aquifer storage and recovery, increased conjunctive use of both groundwater and surface water sources to diversify sources to operate during drought, and then drought response actions to tighten or reduce water use footprint during drought events. And again, I'll highlight an example of each of these project categories with a real-life project example after we cover the overview. The third bin represents kind of a foray into our new, or what we're terming more innovative or expanded scope of alternatives for consumptive use mitigation related to targeting the demand side, not just the water supply side of things, with projects that reduce water use, result in water conservation savings, reuse, recycling, and groundwater recharge as well. And then the last category of eligible projects, the one with the broadest scope of eligibility or environmental and water quality alternatives, we have called out some specific ones here. Groundwater recharge, which having a connection to water quantity would have an attractive, would be attractive relative to scoring under the grant program. Wetland and stream restoration projects are eligible, as is abandoned mine drainage treatment, stormwater management, floodplain reconnection, restoration, preservation as well. So in the next series of 4 slides, we'll highlight a real-world example, or at least the generic real project example in each of these categories. The first is in the water supply alternatives category, and the project we're highlighting here is Bill Meyer Quarry in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, near the town of Bainbridge, immediately west, or east rather, of the Susquehanna River. It was an inactive flooded limestone quarry. It is an inactive flooded limestone quarry over a series of few years in partnership with Lancaster County Solid Waste Management Authority. We studied this quarry. We conducted a pump test. We eradicated invasive mussel species from the quarry, and were ultimately able to enter in an agreement, a water supply storage agreement, to acquire 425 million gallons of water storage in this setting to use for low flow management and drought resilience purposes. It's a good example of a public-private partnership and mitigation project in the water supply category. In the next category, project operations, this is a generic example. The picture underneath, I guess, is not so generic. It's actually Chillisquaque Lake associated with the Montour Steam Electric Station on the Montour Preserve near Washingtonville, Pennsylvania. This project is one that the Commission has been involved with, has no direct agreement or water supply storage purchase at the project, but operations associated with the lake and the intake on the West Branch Susquehanna River have been modified to implement low flow augmentation and acceptable conservation releases such that more natural flow regimes are stored downstream. Drought operation improvements have been made to lessen or mitigate the impacts associated with the consumptive use of water at this power facility during drought conditions. In the demand modification project category, this is another generic example, but the picture you could try to visualize. This is the Harrisburg incinerator, but in concept, this example features an industrial water user with cooling towers in this case, and the idea of implementing water conservation technology through equipment retrofits or upgrades to reduce evaporative loss in the cooling process at a facility like this. And those improved water savings could obviously lessen the water use footprint of this facility during droughts, but also address plume abatement issues and concerns in the local community. And the last example project we have today to showcase is in the environmental and water quality alternatives category. Generically described here, we're looking at a 100-acre property acquisition. On it is 30 acres of wetland and riparian buffer restoration work, and then the opportunity to, with the land purchase and that restoration work, in this case, dedicate the land over to an adjacent piece of state forest land to be protected in perpetuity, as a good example of multi-agency conservation group partnerships. So with this one, it not only demonstrates the kind of what we're after in terms of environmental and water quality projects, but it features the land acquisition piece of the puzzle that really allows the project investment to be maintained over the long term. So with that, I'm going to transition things over to Andy Gavin, our Deputy Executive Director, to close out the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, John, and I'm going to continue with some additional detail as far as making application and what information we'll be looking for in those applications. And really to start off with eligible use of funds, you've probably assessed from the portfolio of projects that John just covered, and if you had a chance to review the guidelines, you'll see a lot of mention of the Commission's, showing a preference and looking for projects that are fairly ready to implement with respect to that there's been a significant amount of planning and design work that's already been accomplished, and it really just needs funding to get it, to the point of implementing on the ground works. Eligible use of funds, so you'll see keyword in there, construction, acquisition of land, purchase of equipment, technology and such, definitely more geared towards, like I said, implementation-ready projects. But that's not to say that the Commission definitely recognizes on the third bullet there, you'll see that, there is permissible planning, site characterization, design work. So if, a project sitting with 80%, 60% designs and needs some last bit of work on the design front or permitting to move it towards implementation, that would be permitted. You can see further down in that list, there's other things such as project monitoring. We certainly recognize, and you'll see in some of the evaluation criteria that we're really looking for projects that are able to show measurable success in some capacity. So as John covered, demand modification projects, and to the extent that it can be tracked how much water was reused or recycled, that's what the Commission would be looking for. To the extent that it's an environmental improvement type project, that it can show, pollutant reduction or added resiliency to the base flow, stream flow interaction, that would be something that the Commission would be looking for. Also something you'll see in there that maybe, is offered in other grant programs, but maybe not as common as the operation and maintenance costs. So the Commission is looking for projects that, there's a commitment to making sure that the practice is in place and successful and sustainable over time, so that the benefit continues on after the performance period of the grant would expire. And then as well, all the typical things you'd see with regards to permissible administrative costs, and recognizing as well there's a benefit to public education and outreach and such surrounding these projects. So, as Drew mentioned and John reinforced, the Commission's hoping to, that these projects will serve as good examples of best practices to undertake to achieve, the Commission goals in consumptive use mitigation. So if you've read the press release and this webinar, this information is not new to you. The total grant funding that we're making available for this first year is in the range of $4 to $6 million. We are looking for projects that are a larger scale, with the hopes that, again, if they're geared towards implementation, more impactful projects. So you will see a preference there for projects that, in the neighborhood of 100,000 or more with respect to requested funds. But we certainly, want to recognize that, what we hope happens the most out of the funds that provided is that projects are bringing other funding sources to leverage the effort and extend the benefit of, the work being done. So it's not a hard, fast line at 100,000, but we definitely want to look to those larger scale projects that we want to manage, rather than dozens and dozens of projects at the 30 to 40,000 range or so. Important to note as well, there is a minimum cash match, so we are looking for projects to come in with and putting some skin in the game. So that's 10% of the requested funds. So not the overall project cost if you're coming to the table, bringing funds from other sources, but we are looking for a minimum cash match of 10% for the requested funds. And then again, hitting on that note of implementation, we hope to see in the grant performance period, we do have roughly a 3-year window that we're hoping projects will, be covered. As far as the application goes, if you've hit our website, you'll see there's a landing page with a lot of supporting information, links to the consumptive use mitigation policy that Drew referenced, to the other materials that will be used in the application. But the online application itself, we're hoping, if you're familiar with applying for funding from federal, other state sources in the region, that it largely will be familiar to you. We weren't trying to reinvent the wheel with the information we're requesting in the format of either the online application or even with the supplementals that we're asking applicant upload, such as narrative, project scope, and budget there, you'll see. So it's a mix of online fields to fill out on the application page, but then also some materials that, will be expected to be uploaded in PDF format. Important to note, we are hoping it's user-friendly. It will require user registration, and that's hopefully convenience for you, and that you can start an application and continue it later as you have time or as you gather more information needed for the application. And John alluded to it earlier, there is a full set of standard criteria and then criteria against which, each of the project types will be reviewed. But this just gives you a rundown of some of the key evaluation criteria, and John hit on some of them. Obviously, again, the theme, we're looking for projects consistent with the policy that our commissioners adopted a year and a half ago. We're obviously, John showed the map earlier that showed regions of the basin where, the commission does have concerns, higher levels of consumptive use. Also, those are, a prevalence of where projects paying the mitigation fee are located. So there's definitely a benefit to working, in some targeted areas throughout the basin. As you know, the commission sort of niche on consumptive use management has to do with water quantity management. But with this latest iteration of the policy, as Drew and John have mentioned, we are expanding alternatives in environmental improvement because we do recognize in certain settings, less water isn't better if there's a high pollutant load in that stream or other water source. So obviously, if you're reducing pollutant loads, pollutant levels in certain streams and such, that increases the resiliency with which the ecosystem can adapt when we hit low flows. So if the water's cleaner, that's one less stress on the ecosystem to absorb during those conditions. And then I mentioned shovel-ready project implementation already, as well as the long-term project benefits we're looking for, and hence the reasoning behind allowing for operation and maintenance costs to be recouped. So lastly, again, the schedule, that's been in the press release. It's on our website. Just to go over it again here during the webinar, as Drew mentioned, we just released the grant program a couple weeks ago. We are looking for grant applications to be due by the end of January. Looking to review applications in February, March timeframe. Obviously, we'll have to see what our volume is as well, recognizing, as Drew said, this is our first go at this as far as the grant program goes. But, our targets right now are to look to announce grants awarded, selected and awarded in April, and then have agreements executed in June, really coincident with the Commission's new fiscal year, which starts in July of 2022. So that lays out the basics of, what we hope to cover here in the webinar.